Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second installment in the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion series. Thank you all so much for joining. It's a hot one today, so thank you for giving us our time or your time. My name is Mackenzie Wright, and I am the Alumni and Development Coordinator for Excelsior University. Tonight, we are joined by Excelsior's founding director for the Center for Social Justice, Pascoe Aguilar, and our program director for the Center for Social Justice, Pamela Jimenez. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to please hold any questions or comments for the end of the presentation. We are going to take 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A section at the end, so everyone can get their questions or any comments that you might have in then. At that time, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. I will try to monitor the chat, but it's really helpful if we use the Q&A. Additionally, we are going to send out a survey at the presentation or at the end of the presentation via the chat that we hope that everyone will participate in. So we ask for your participation. We're looking forward to your questions and your comments and your participation tonight. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Daniel and Pam. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Good evening, everyone. I wonder, Pam, if you'd like to introduce yourself in case anyone in the room does not know you.
Sure. So as Mackenzie said, I am Pamela Jimenez, and I am the program director for the Center for Social Justice. And I've been with Excelsior for 2 years and in higher education for about, oh gosh, I'm going to age myself, years. And I have a doctorate in education, in higher education administration with a concentration in social justice. And my master's is in mental health psychology, addiction counseling. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And my name is Daniel Pascoe Aguilar. I am founding director of the Center for Social Justice and Chief Diversity Officer at Excelsior. I've been at Excelsior almost a year and a half. I'm a few days away from a year and a half. And it's been a wonderful experience so far. And we're delighted to be here with you. I have been in higher education as my fifth career, 22 years now. So I'm also aging myself, Pam.
Well, you started when you were 5.
That's right. Thank you. I appreciate that. But it's really wonderful to have you here. I know that it's a hot day. It is Friday Eve, so you could be doing a lot of other things. And we're very excited that you have decided to join us, particularly as we engage in discussion and conversation, exploration of our intercultural development. Today, we have, I'm biased, but I think we have a treat for you. We're going to share with you a very exciting model, the model of multiple dimensions of identity by Jones, McEwen, and Aves. So we'll talk to you, of course, more about it. But before we get there, we'd like to give you a little nutshell of what we covered last time, because these sessions are a series. And we want you to know where we are right now, what we have covered, and then what we will cover afterwards. So if it's okay, let's go ahead and get started. Let me first say I'm dealing a little bit with COVID still, so my throat might act out. And if that's the case, I might have to mute myself for just a couple of seconds. So please forgive me if I have to do that. Okay, so as you can see in the screen, what we are doing in this series of workshops is to share a framework that we have introduced at Excelsior. You might recall, or you might have heard, that the beginning or the initiation of the Center for Social Justice and the agenda that we are trying to facilitate intentionally started with a listening tour. So we had sessions with alums, with students, with faculty, and with staff, over 40 of them. We connected with over 400 community members of Excelsior to make sure that we were developing an agenda that was as inclusive and as systemic as we could, to make sure that we did our work as comprehensively as possible. So one of the themes that developed, which I loved, was the interest and the need to operate under a framework. A framework allows us to do our work individually and as teams in a way that works for us, but as an organization to do it collectively in concert. So it allows for customization, but yet consistency. So Pam and I had the opportunity then to develop a framework that we have introduced to every unit of Excelsior, and we're doing this with every stakeholder group. So it's part of a cornerstone course that every student takes at Excelsior. We're doing this series with alums, and we have done also series sessions with faculty, and we're about to reintroduce it in a summit we're about to facilitate in June 13. So to just give you a quick reminder of the framework, we call it the JEDI map. And as a reminder, JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So know that that's what we refer to when we say JEDI. And MAP stands for Mindset, Approach, and Policies and Procedures. And this is a very intentional combination of elements for a couple of reasons. The first one is that the more I research the work that we need to do in JEDI, the more I talk to experts in this field, the more clear it becomes to me that an organizational effort on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion development requires two aspects of our work. One is it requires everyone's involvement and everyone's work in developing individually. In other words, everybody assuming some level of ownership and becoming engaged in the process for personal development and for their contribution to the organization in a more intercultural way. So there's this individual part that needs to be part of the effort. Now, of course, in addition to that, or in combination with that, it is critical that we have a team and organizational approach to developing as an institution, as a community. And the two need to go hand in hand. So this framework is designed to focus on both, on our individual development as members of the Excelsior community, but also as teams and as an organization as a whole. So mindset is trying to challenge our individual assumptions. Approach is trying to, based on our challenging of our assumptions, to shift our behavior, to begin to interact differently with each other. And policies and procedures are a strategic attempt to scale our effort so that it becomes collective as teams and as an organization, as stakeholder groups. So know that intentionally we have those two aspects of our work in this framework, our individual development and our organizational and team development. And of course, as you can see in the progression, it is very important for us to understand that we make assumptions. We all have some level of implicit bias. The question is, what do we do with that? And how do we challenge it in order to shift our approach and then scale it for our organizational intercultural development? Next slide, please, Mackenzie. So last time we talked about how do we challenge our assumptions. So we focused on mindset. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we, if you were with us, we focused on a model that allows us to see where we are in our intercultural sensitivity. It goes through phases that move us from ethnocentrism to ethno-relativism. But basically, it is how do we experience difference? How do we perceive and interact with any difference, with what is foreign to us? And it starts on the very left with denial of other experiences and perspectives, or defending our own as a second phase, or minimizing differences to the extent that we could run the risk of ignoring them, And then moving into acceptance of differences, into adaptation based on differences, and into integration. So we talked a little bit about how this model can help us assess where we are and how we can move to a more intercultural sensitive approach to our interactions and our perception. But we focus most of our attention on the premise of the model. So we go to the next slide. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Milton Bennett, who developed this model. And when asking him about the source of the model, where had he developed it, or what was its premise, he said it's a very simple observation. And that is that as human beings, we have the tendency to think of ourselves as highly complex individuals. That if you ask me who I am likely to tell you about my family and about our health and our finances and our education and careers and hobbies and everything that makes me happy and keeps me up at night. A very complex picture of my experience. Now, he said, unfortunately, the observation continues by noticing that as human beings, we also have the tendency, when we perceive or interact with others, particularly those who are different to us, to not see the same level of complexity in their experiences or in their perspectives. So if you go to the next slide, Mackenzie, the opportunity here is to assume the same level of complexity in others than the one that I assume in my experience and my perspective. That's not an easy task. Keep in mind that this has been one of the greatest challenges of the human race. We often become afraid of difference, to the point, so unfortunately, in many instances, including today, to the point of genocide, right? When we don't understand differences, we don't value differences. Dr. Bennett talks about it as we start having a hard time seeing the humanity in others. And keep in mind that this doesn't depend on our ability to understand someone else's experience or perspective. There are many experiences and there are many perspectives that we will never have the capacity to understand because we haven't walked those footsteps, right? We shared examples last time, but the importance of this premise is that we need to understand that this challenge or opportunity of assuming the same level of complexity in others than the one that I assume in mine is regardless of our ability or inability to understand another experience or another perspective. That's where the rubber meets the road. So how can we find ways of assuming the same level of complexity, even if I don't understand that other trajectory? And therefore, how can I become inquisitive and observant and respectful and inclusive in my approach to others close to me or very different and away from me? So that's what we covered. We went through some exercises and conversation in this regard. Now, what we want to do, if we move to the next slide, is we want to talk about our approach. Now that we have challenged our assumptions, we want to explore our and others' complexity. So let me share with you an analogy that I think is going to be helpful to understand what we're trying to do today. We're going to introduce to you a very powerful model by researchers in college and university settings called the Model of Multiple Dimensions of Identity by Jones, McEwen, and Aves. Now, the analogy is the process through which we go in order to learn a second language. If you have studied a second language, know a second language, or are trying to learn a second language, you might have already experienced the fact that it is very helpful and actually important to know as much about your language in order to learn a foreign language. So knowing the grammar of your language, the vocabulary of your language, the conjugations of your language, the different forms that words can take in your language, word agreement. Understanding that structure then allows you to compare how the other language works, what is its structure, and then learn it, right? You learn it by comparison. At least that's what research says. And in my experience, that has been the case because English is my second language. Now, what we're going to do today is going to use the model of multiple dimensions of identity as a way to further explore our own identities. Like if we were learning more about our own language, in order to be better prepared and able to see the complexity in others. Because once we see how complex we are, it is easier to assess the complexity in others, to assume that complexity in others. So if we move to the next slide, you must have seen charts like this. There's a bunch of them. I like these, even though none of them are exhaustive. This is by Loyola University, Chicago, that has internal and external dimensions of what Abe, Jones, and McEwen talked about as multiple dimensions of identity. Notice the diversity of constructs and of dimensions and of ways in which we identify ourselves, in which our environment identifies us, right, or defines us, and how meaningful and important and determining this can be, right? Like Pam and I were just talking about our age, right, and our gender identity, our ability or disability, our race, our immigrant experience, our sexual orientation, and that's just one dimension. If you go to the external circle, and whether we're first generation or our political beliefs, right, with everything that's happening right now, the language we spoke or we speak at home, our religious or spiritual beliefs, I mean, all these things are very deep and they interact with each other, right? They're not isolated. So I just want you to begin to assess the level of complexity that makes us who we are, that makes you who you are, and begin to identify the areas or the dimensions with which you identify or that define you one way or another. Now, the model that we want to share with you doesn't only go into the characteristics that you see in this chart. It actually talks about the dynamics between them. So what we're going to do is walk you through the model by sharing with you piece by piece. How does it look? I'll give you examples. Pam will give you examples. And then we'll ask you to begin to assess your own complexity. Now, we are aware that some of you might be making dinner or sitting with your family, or you might be doing laundry. So we're very respectful of where you are. If you can, if you're at a table or a computer and you can maybe draw what we're sharing with you, then feel free to do that so that you can chart your complexity. But if you're not, you can just reflect about it, right? We'll give you examples, we'll show you things. What we want you to take away today is going deeper into the complexity of your identity based on this MMDI model, and then using that together to figure out how can we assume complexity in others to be able to see each other's humanity more deeply. So if we go to the next slide, Abe, Johnson, McEwen did something really interesting. They worked with a number of students in college and university environments, and they did their research. So this whole model stems out of their research with college students. College students are the ones who informed them about how this model was supposed to look. And they did a series of case studies, and they did a fantastic job. The more I learn about it, and the more I read applications of it in different environments, I see the impact that it can have. So the simplest concept that they discovered was that we all had a combination of dimensions of identity, like in the chart that I shared with you. And one thing they identified very quickly was that these dimensions were dynamic. They were moving all the time. They were changing all the time. They were making us feel different in different environments at different times in different scenarios. They also identified that all of them were interacting with each other. There was no dimension that was isolated and had nothing to do with another. So here I have just put 3 to get us into an example of it. And what they did is they depicted them as orbits because they're moving constantly and they're interacting with each other. So you see here the purple, the green, and the red or the pink are touching each other actually multiple times, right? So imagine if these were like an atom, right? There's a lot of movement. There are things moving around and intersecting with each other. Now, there are supposed to be more than just 3, but we thought that this was the easiest way to begin to grasp the concept. If we go to the next slide, I can begin to share with you some of my dimensions of identity. So in my case, I'm an immigrant. I was born and grew up in Mexico City. I came to the United States when I was 23, came straight to seminary to do a Master of Divinity, and that has transformed my reality. Since then, I'm an immigrant, and that means a lot of things to me, right? Like I can tell you a lot of stories, some good, some really bad, right? Like there's a lot of depth in that dimension of identity of mine. If we go to the next slide, I can also tell you that part of my experience is that I have grown up with dyslexia. So I'm neurodiverse. And something really interesting is I discovered that I was dyslexic at 40. So my whole growing up experience was like, what on earth is happening to me, right? Because people thought that I was lazy or not very smart. And I sometimes was starting to believe it. But they didn't even diagnose that when I was growing up in Mexico City. And that dyslexia, now I see a lot of benefits to it, a lot of challenges to it, but I have learned to grow up with it and it defines me, right? And if people know, that also defines me externally to some extent. So that's another dimension that I decided to highlight because it's prominent in my experience. And a third one that I can share with you is I'm a male, right? And so I want you to, if we go to the next slide, notice that some of these dimensions make me a member of a target group, right? With limited or no privilege, like an immigrant, or in some cases, my dyslexia. In some of the cases, some of these dimensions can make me a member of a non-target group. Therefore, me experiencing privilege, right? And this also begins to help us identify, well, what do we do with these dimensions? What is my responsibility and what is my opportunity, right? How do I grow from this? How do I use this to become a better person and more inclusive and equitable? All right, so notice all of them are dynamic, they're moving, all of them are intersecting, and there are some that make me a member of a target and some that make me a member of a non-target group. So begin to think of your dimensions. Which 3 would you choose, right, for this exercise? If we go to the next slide, notice that we have the same chart, but with X, Y, and Z, because I want you to think of your dimensions. And to get started, Pam, if you're willing, if you could share at least a couple of examples of your dimensions as well.
Sure. So I would say that my Y is probably being an American Latina. I define myself as an American Latina. My Z would probably be a woman. And my X would be first generation. All 3 define me and have defined how I look at the world. And again, as you said, put me in a privileged position and at the same time, put me in a target, right? In a target group. Being a Latina being the first Latina in my family, right? Born in America makes a huge difference. My experiences versus my sister's experience, how I got financial aid, how I navigated college, how easy it was for me to get into college because I could get financial aid. But at the same time, being first generation was very difficult because my parents didn't know anything about the college system in this country. That put me at a disadvantage, not having my parents come to simple things like orientation, or, thinking that they didn't need to sign paperwork, or not even knowing what financial aid was. But at the same time, being eligible, now that I know what DACA is, now that I know how education works, I'm very privileged to have been born in this country. And then, of course, being a woman, which absolutely has defined my experience, I would say has definitely put me in both for me, privilege, because I will talk a little bit more about core identity, but also, in the realm of certain things, being an underrepresented individual in certain organizations, in certain disciplines, in certain fields.
Thank you,
So,
Pam.
sure.
Thank you so much for sharing. Really appreciate that.
Of course.
All right. So we want you to think of three dimensions of identity that are salient to you, right? And if you can write them down. And if that's the case, I would recommend drawing the orbits and writing down the labels of each of them. If you are not where you can write something down, think about them. Think what will be your three dimensions. Know that there are many more, but for this exercise, we're asking you to think of three. All right, if we go to the next slide. I just want to depict how this looks like with all the dimensions that we have at play. And I didn't draw more because there's no more space, right? There's a lot of complexity in our experience and our perspective. We move to the next slide. So the next piece that Aves, Jones, and McKeown identified, and remember, this was work with college students, was that beyond the dimensions of identity we have been talking about, students were indicating that they had an identity core, different, separate from the dimensions, interrelated but different. So a student, for example, said, I am strong. Well, strong was not in the distribution of dimensions of identity that we shared with you at the beginning, right? Or I am independent. Another one said, I am a good friend. Another one said, I am a mother, right? So these are not necessarily demographic characteristics or dimensions of identity, but rather very deep, unique ways in which students wanted to identify themselves based on something that really mattered to them. Like, imagine for the student who said, I'm independent, what must it have meant to that student to say, I am now living on my own, right? I can survive on my own. I can do things independently, decisions, take care of myself, take care of others if necessary. I mean, that goes really deep. Now, that, if you notice, is the identity core that is inside the orbit. So it is related, it is interactive, but it is separate, right? It is something else, the identity core. So we go to the next slide. I can give you my example. For a while, I defined my identity core as empathically resilient. For many years, that was empathically resilient. And guess what happened? I adopted a beautiful Mayan little girl when she was 50 years old, and it changed my whole life. She's now 8 years old, and since then, my identity core is that I'm a father. And I cannot even begin to tell you how deep that goes, how much that means to me, right? It conveys a lot of meaning in my experience, in my perspective. My identity core is that I am a father. I think of that every time. And I try to be the best every day based on that identity core. Now, that is surrounded by all my dimensions that I was mentioning to you. But I have an identity core that is unique. So I want you to start thinking of what would you say is your identity core? And of course, you have time to think, but at least try something tonight. So we go to the next slide. We have a space for you to to put it in. But before we ask you to do it, maybe Pam, if you could share what you would determine is your identity
Sure,
core.
I would say the same thing as a woman. I have the privilege of being a mother as well, and of having given birth to my daughter. So that definitely took me out. A nurturer has always been my identity core, and definitely at the center of who I am. She is everything to me. And that experience that I got, that I was privileged enough to be able to have, in that way, is also very salient to me, and I'm very aware, and it surrounds my entire, my whole life. It's my whole life.
Thank you,
So,
Pam. Thank you
sure,
for
of
sharing
course.
that. That's very kind of you. Okay, I'm gonna move a little faster because I'm noticing that time is flying. So we go to the next slide. Well, before we go to the next slide, Mackenzie, remember to think of your identity core. What might that be, right? So if you are sitting on in a place where you can write it down, if not, at least keep it in your mind. So you now have 3 dimensions of identity and a core, an identity core that you're thinking about. Okay, we go to the next slide. There's something else that next slide, please, that the authors of this model identified, and that was that for each identity, there was what they found or called a level of salience or a level of awareness, that these dimensions of identity showed up in different ways at different times in different spaces. I mean, think of me as a male. What happens if I'm in a room full of males? What happens if I'm in a room full of females, right? And how different will I feel? Or if I'm an immigrant in a room full of immigrants versus a room full of domestic people in the United States, right? It immediately changes the way in which I feel and potentially the way in which I interact and how I think of my identity, how present it is in my mind. So these levels of salience are very important because they determine at a given point how aware might we be about our dimension of identity. And they depicted it by a dot within or as part of the orbit for each of the dimensions. So we go to the next slide. You see here, for example, that immigrant shows up to me very close to my core. That means 2 things. I am aware of it most of the time, particularly with everything that's happening recently with politics, and I'm very aware of my immigrant identity and the immigrant identity of my family. It's present in me. I'm observant of it. And notice also that it is close to my identity core, which also means, this is a finding that Aves Johnson McEwen did, that meant that most likely being an immigrant makes me a member of a target group, that I have less privilege than others based on that dimension of identity. Now, in comparison to that, if we go to the next slide, you'll notice that dyslexia has a different level of salience. Next slide, Mackenzie. Thank you. So you notice that the other dot is not as close as my immigrant dimension to my identity core, if you notice. Why? Because I have, even though dyslexia is a very defining dimension to me, I have managed it. And actually, in many circumstances, I have begun to think of it as an advantage. My intuition is very clear, right? It is very present and very strong. And my ability to connect dots is a little easier than for other people. So to me, that dot is not as close because I'm kind of in between it making me a member of a target group and a member of a non-target group. And then if you look at my male dimension of identity, if we go to the next slide, then you'll notice that my dot is far away from my core. Mackenzie, if you can go to the next slide. Notice how that is far. Why? Because that one makes me a member of a non-target group. And very often, this is the definition of privilege. I don't need to worry about it when I know that many others worry about it based on their gender or their gender identity, right? So I have a privilege, and what do I do with that? So what we want you to do is to think, where would the levels of salience be in your dimensions of identity, the 3 that you have selected? So we go to the next slide. You'll see that there's a space for you to think of yours. Where might your dots be? And Pam, could you give us an example of one of your dimensions and where your level of salience is?
Probably the first generation. It had defined what I do, right? Everything that I do is defined by that experience of being privileged to be able to get into college, of being privileged to be able to have, to not know, but at the same time, be able to navigate the process, because I do have citizenship or residency, or, I do have citizenship in this country. And so I am able to get financial aid, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to go to college. My parents wouldn't have been able to afford it. So while at the same time being first generation defined it I struggled, it also defined me later on when I chose to help others and create spaces in higher education for others, and to make that process and access to higher education easier for them, knowing the privilege that I had, and at the same time knowing the difficult road, because I didn't have my parents, I didn't have social capital to help me get into college. So it defined my entire experience, and it's very near to my core, where, other things, perhaps, my citizenship may not be, there are days that I don't, it makes me privileged. So it doesn't make me part of a target group, or it doesn't make me, but it does frame how I look at the world, and makes me more empathetic in that respect. So
Thank you, Pam. Thank you for sharing. That's
of course.
That's very interesting. So of course, what we want you to do is, now that you have identified your dimensions, you have identified your core, we want you to identify what are your levels of salience. Where would you put your dots for each of your dimensions? Now we go to the next slide. This is something that APES did to reinforce this model that APES Johnson McKeown had developed. And she identified that in addition to all these elements that we had been talking about, there were contextual influences that were affecting our multiple dimensions of identity. And think of it: social media, news, influences at work, influences in our community, right? Pressures of different types, financial, family, time. Like, there are so many contextual influences that are affecting who we are, how we define ourselves, and how we negotiate who we are with what's coming our way. If we go to the next slide. Mackenzie, could you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So they also identified that based on those contextual influences and our dimensions of identity, we were playing with, or we are playing with, a meaning-making filter. What do we do with the influences that come our way? And basically what they identified in the students with whom they were working is that some students had these filters that had big holes and were really thin and allowed everything in. So the student, right, in their case study, was like bouncing back and forth, being affected and influenced by the contextual content that was coming their way in a regular basis. They also identified a meaning-making filter that had very narrow holes and was really thick, that allowed the student to negotiate who they were, to remain authentic as they dealt with contextual influences. They called a meaning-making filter that allowed everything in, formulaic, and they called the one that allows the student or allow the student to negotiate a foundational meaning making filter. And some students were in a transitional making filter, that they were developing their ability to negotiate with the external influences. So a question here to reflect on is, what are external contextual influences that are affecting your identity in a regular basis? And how are you prepared to deal with them? How much can you negotiate who you are in front of the influences to which you are exposed? Now, this is very important because at the end of the day, we believe that our power, our ability to survive and thrive as a human race, as organizations, as teams, as an organization, is based on the richness of our diversity. In other words, we need you to be who you are. We need you to be authentic. We need you based on your uniqueness, what you bring, who you are, how you define yourself, what is your identity core, your dimensions of identity, your levels of salience, your filter. But we need you to be who you are, because together, by being authentic and being unique, we'll be able to contribute what the world needs and what organizations need in order to do better, to find better ways to solve challenges and to raise to the occasion for opportunities for innovation. So this is a very important part of this model, right? How do we turn our meaning-making filter into a foundational one that allows us to negotiate who we are in front of the contextual influences that come our way? And how can we help others develop that level of meaning-making filter that allows them to remain authentic and to negotiate? To me, if you ask me, that's what I'm here to do at Excelsior University, to find a way to help every community member, particularly students, to develop that foundational meaning-making filter by knowing better who they are, what are their multiple dimensions of identity, and be readier, right, to engage and hopefully to have an impact and to challenge the status quo. If we go to the next slide, I want you to see now the model as we add dimensions of identity with all their levels of salience, right? And then if we go to the next slide, there are more than 3 contextual influences that come our way. So just be aware, if you go to the next slide, Mackenzie, you'll see that there are multiple influences that are affecting us in a regular basis. So this is the model. And what we want you to do is to reflect on the complexity you experience, on the complexity of your perspective, on the importance of valuing that complexity and of negotiating that complexity with whatever influences come your way. But very importantly, what we are hoping to do is to help you see that if we are as complex as this, the person next to you right now is as complex. The person with whom you work, the person you teach, the person who's at the other end of the globe that we don't know, who has an entirely different experience and perspective of the world and of reality, has the same level of complexity. And our ability to see everybody else's humanity, regardless of our ability to understand it, to assume the same level of complexity, is in a large extent dependent on our ability to see ours and to assume that level of complexity in others. Pam, would you like to take us to the reflection questions?
So if I could just share my screen.
We have prepared some reflection questions based on what we have covered today.
And when you put in, know that this is completely anonymous. We don't know who is in. So if you go into menti.com, even from your phone, you put in this code, you're able to just give us your takeaways of your experience exploring your complexity through your dimensions of identity, even if it's after the session has closed today. So the second slide, and you're able to navigate these slides yourself. How does this reflection affect your awareness about the complexity of your and others' experience or perspectives? And then what follow-up actions or behaviors could you implement to see and respond to the complexity in others as much as you see complexity in you? So if and when you can give us some feedback, again, it's completely anonymous. If you go on to menti.com and you enter this code 46285944, you can enter your answers. They're open-ended, and we think
you can do it in your phone
advance.
or in your computer. And you
Correct.
can, if you input content now, we can see the content that you input without knowing who you are.
Right.
So we'll wait to see if you respond to these questions, but simultaneously we can engage in a conversation, responding to questions or to comments or thoughts, feedback on what we experienced today. So let me open the floor. We have 10 minutes, right, Mackenzie?
We do, yeah, we have 10 minutes. So if folks want to use that Q&A, and I can direct the questions over to you both, or if people want to put in the chat, whatever works.
Or any input that you have in Mentimeter, then we'll be able to see and comment on it. Don't be shy. Using Menti is a lot of fun, actually. We've been using it quite a bit.
It is. You get to see your responses and other people's responses.
You just need to go to menti.com and enter the code, and then there we go. We are complex, but we can decide to be open to change and diverse thoughts. Yes.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've always found it really interesting how, I think I might have mentioned this before in a previous session. An organizational behaviorist, Peter Drucker, analyzed the different systems with which we interact: human, biological, ecological, and mechanical systems. And after his research, he identified that human systems are the most capable of change, meaning they're the most elastic. But of the four, they're also the most resistant to change, right? And I think that part of our challenge in interacting and perceiving differences is that often we're really resistant to change, and interacting with difference requires some level of adaptation, sometimes change, right? It threatens to some extent the reality as we know it. So I think you're right on point. We can decide to be open to change and to diverse thoughts.
Absolutely. One of the things I asked Daniel when he first introduced this model to me, there are many different models, right? And one of the things I said to him was, there are folks, including myself, that we want to believe that we are simple folks, right? That we're not complicated folks, that we want the same things that everybody else wants in life. But one of the things that this model, as well as the model that I used in my dissertation, which was the racial identity model, the most important piece for the model would be the contextual influences, right? When the experiences that you have meet that identity that may be more salient or less salient to you, then it kind of reveals certain aspects of the way you feel towards that identity, if I'm not mistaken. And Daniel said to me, of course, it's not that we're complicated, it's just that there are many layers all of us have, Oh, good. We
More
have
comments. That's
coming in.
fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you for keeping an open mind. I know this is a complex model, but it's supposed to help us see our complexity. And as I was mentioning at the beginning, it's like if you want to learn a second language, learning more about the complexity of your language helps you learn the structure of the new language. So thank you for being here with us. And this presentation was outstanding. Thank you. I was hesitant because of the complexity. I didn't want to overwhelm people, but I found this model to be transformative. And I love that this was informed by college student experience.
Mhm.
Like it was like learning from them, right, based on what they were assessing. Mackenzie, is there another question, or
See any questions
we
in our
comment?
Q&A or in our chat? Just a few responses in the Menti meter. I did see that someone said something about attending more webinars like this. We do have the recording from our first session in this series. If you would like that recording, whoever anonymously responded to Mentimeter, please feel free to email me and I can send it over to you. I'm going to just put the alumni inbox email, which anyone can also write to if you have any questions about this presentation as well. I can always forward them over to Daniel and Pam, but this is alumni@excelsior.edu. So we have that recording. We'll have this recording, which is going to be sent to everyone. So if you missed any bits of this presentation, if you had to run out for a second, or if you joined late, no worries, you can get the whole thing. And we will be having more sessions as part of this series. So our next session in the series will be sometime in the fall. We like to give a little break for webinar presentations over the summer. We know that folks are busy. It's the summertime, we get it. But we will be restarting the JEDI webinar series back up in the fall. So we're very, very excited. And maybe Daniel and Pam, you guys can talk a little bit about how that'll be a meeting. So we'll have a little bit of a chance to chit chat on a more personal basis for that one.
Yeah, so one thing to mention, which I promised to do and I almost forget, is we started by talking about our mindsets and challenging our assumptions with the model that I shared we discussed last time, and the premise of seeing complexity in others like we see in ours. Today, we started to talk about our approach. So before it was challenging our assumptions, that last session. This session was beginning to modify our approach to differences. And what we are doing is dividing that in two. So we'll have another session on approach through a very interesting strategy called the development of third cultures that the Intercultural Development Research Institute recommends. So we'll talk about that, and we'll do also exercise and reflection in that particular regard. And then the fourth session will be, how do we scale this, right? We'll share with you how we've done it at Excelsior. We're in the middle of doing that right now, and how you can do it in the environments in which you operate, right? In your teams, in your organizations, in your community, in your family. You know, an approach that you can take to collectively begin to shift the way in which you are more inclusive and equitable in the interactions that you have. And then session 5, we're toying with us bringing the intercultural development inventory as an option for you. So if that's something that's of interest to you, we'll let you know more information, but then you'll be able to take an inventory and have that interpreted as a group in our final session. So a lot more to come. Great content. I mean, we're using models that are really very well developed and very interesting, and we're delighted to be working with you. So if you have any questions in between, please don't hesitate. We can talk about this further.
Thank you, Daniel.
So as you were
Someone
speaking, I began writing thoughts that led me to acknowledge a different point of view. I meant to say it different. Okay. So I would invite Donald, I'm sorry, to actually email us so that maybe he can join one of our chats. We have them every Thursday in our communities group, and we would love to have a conversation about further exploring, you know, your thoughts on this. If you could, Mackenzie, could you put our email there, and then we could, Donald, if you could just give us your email, and we can invite you to our chats. We host chats every Thursday, the Center for Social Justice, and we try to get the message out. Sometimes it doesn't get to everybody, but we would love to have folks that are interested in this topic in our communities, different communities, join us. Thank you. I'll take that down
Yeah,
and
thank
I
you.
will.
And remember,
put
in
certain-
this subject, there's no right or wrong.
Correct.
There's growth, right?
Right.
And opportunity.
And
So
different models.
having the conversation, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's what it takes, right? It's a never-ending process.
And I'm actually going to also put the Center for Social Justice webpage link
Oh, that was wonderful.
for folks to check
Yeah.
out as well. There's some
Yeah.
good stuff on there. All right. Any last minute questions or comments from folks? Put in the Q&A or the chat. If not, no worries. Just want to say a big thank you to both of you. As always,
Thank you.
wonderful presentation. I know that it's beneficial to all of our participants, to the Excelsior community. It's going to go out to everyone, but it's always enjoyable to watch on my end too. So I hope the participants tonight enjoyed.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
you,
Thank you,
Mackenzie.
everyone.
Of
So
course.
good to be with you this hour.
Thank you,
Thank you for the
Mackenzie. Thank you,
opportunity.
everyone.